think in maybe 2007, 2008. And I read her manifesto, it's actually entitled Manifesto for Abstractionists and Friends of the Non-Objective. And I felt like it was a really radical, it was refreshingly radical to take a position, to have a point of view, or to define that point of view, rather. So I was tremendously excited to get to know her work over the course of the last several years. I will say that Rebecca received her BA from Smith College, her MFA from the School of the Arts in Chicago, and also attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Morris received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Tiffany Foundation grant, and an Art Matters grant. She has exhibited her work at the Renaissance Society in Chicago, as well as Corbett and Dempsey, Harris Lieberman, Gallery Barbara Weiss, and the Santa Monica Museum of Art. And most recently, Made in Space, an exhibition at Gavin Brown Enterprise in New York was reviewed in the New York Times. And recently announced is Rebecca Morris's inclusion in the Whitney Biennial 2014. Morris is a professor of painting at the Pasadena City College and a part-time lecturer at UCLA. We are very, very lucky to have Rebecca Morris visiting us today, and please join me in a big round of applause.
Thank you. So I have given artist lectures for a long time, and I've gotten really tired of my lecture. And normally what I do is I go through everything fairly chronologically, and then when I redo a lecture, I just tack on the newest stuff and maybe lop something off the beginning. But lately when I've done that, I just feel kind of bad afterwards. Like empty and a little depressed by my own work somehow. And I think that this very linear telling of my development of an artist is too linear, or I kind of have the story down so much that it feels sort of trite, or I don't know, I'm bored by it. So I've kind of changed how I'm doing the lecture tonight. So I hope it makes sense, and I hope I'm clear, because I'm going to kind of jump around time periods a little bit. But I'm hoping that this will be a more authentic way to describe or communicate my thoughts about making work and what my work looks like and how it's developed. And I don't really see like making art as a completely linear process. So making the lecture totally linear, I think sort of does a disservice to the creative process, or at least how I'm thinking about mine these days. In any case, this first image is an installation view of a show that I had this past May in 2013 in Lingen, Germany, at a Kunsthalle there. It's a really incredible space. The show is going to travel this spring in April to the Bonnefanten Museum, which is in Maastricht, Holland, and they're making a book for it. And this space in Lingen is actually an old railroad car repair building. They would just repair trains in here, so it's that massive. And the space is just really beautiful. And one of the exciting parts about it was that I could really hang my work with a lot of room and a lot of space. And the paintings tend to be large. And since it's also not a gallery venue, it's not about, there's no pressure to sort of have work in it to sell. It's really just about the work itself. And I enjoyed that experience immensely. And so this is the first sort of picture I have of it. And then this is looking the other way. Something that was exciting about this space additionally is the way that it's lit. It has skylights everywhere on the roof and then a few large windows. And the light in Germany is a cooler, very even light, especially when I was there in May. And this light is incredibly similar to the light in my studio. The light in my studio is, I only have skylights, and I don't use any electric light at all, and I paint just in the day. It's a very severe sort of way that I've worked in this studio, which I've been in for about 2 years. But I just never really wanted to pay all the money to install a good lighting system, especially since I don't really enjoy painting at night. And the light in Southern California is so gorgeous that I've really just been able to rely on natural light, and that's the best way to see what the work really looks like. And so much of my work is really about color and color relationships. So the joy for me was to see this work as it looked in my studio, looking the same way in the exhibition space. Because often when your work is exhibited, it's in a completely different location, the light is different, maybe there's no natural light at all, and the work can really change in its appearance. And so it was nice to, for one time, have the work really look like what it looked like to me. Most of the work in this show is fairly recent. I think the earliest works might have been 2010 or 2011. I've done a lot of paintings that have a circular motif, such as this one. This is actually an oval. And then a lot of the other paintings from this exhibition have borders or kind of framic elements built into the composition. So this one I think is, you know what, this one might even be 2009. So this is probably the earliest piece. And I loved the way it was installed here because you can see that the wall is painted white up until a point, and then there's this sort of natural concrete color. And that really just mirrored the way that this painting was made, which was that the circle, the oval inside is just the gesso left, and then there's a very light gray that's painted in the negative space after the oval. And I just thought in this location it really kind of repeated the architecture in a very coincidental way. And this is the thing with geometric abstract painting. It just looks really good in architecture. It's always picking up something. And then the very thin border is raised paint that's spray painted gold. So it's this thin little metallic edge. This gives you a very good sense of what the entire space looked like, and for every show they reconfigure it depending on the exhibition. So the curator asked me how I wanted the walls built inside, and I had no idea. And I just said, just pick something and let me know, because honestly, she knows the space way better than me. I had never been there before. So they came up with this really weird zigzag wall that went through the middle of the space, and I loved it because at this point I was doing some zigzags in my work. So I thought it was a kind of hilarious aspect to have the structure of the exhibition sort of match something or have a communication with the paintings. So I think you can kind of just see it in this picture, see it here. And then my work, the pieces tend to be somewhat differing from each other, and so it's really, in terms of installing it, I have to really think about what works well next to each other. And in some ways it's pretty easy to install my work because it either works or it doesn't, pretty clearly, at least to me. So that painting with the red grid in the border, that's, just to give you a sense of scale, that's 106 inches by 80.5. So it's pretty big. And then that's a side view of it. I make the paintings flat on the floor. And you can see that I often use the side of the painting, the edge, to test colors. I don't really mind if it shows up later. Sometimes I do the bottom of the canvas because that's the part that people won't see as much, but I can run out of room there, so sometimes I have to use the sides. And this is one of my favorite installation shots because I just love the way this painting gets so much space. And again, this is a really unique opportunity, and it's really cool to be able to see your work sort of in this luxurious installation. So again, I'm just like walking you through this install. And then that's a picture of my studio, so you can see some of the pieces there, and maybe you can see that the light is somewhat similar. I paint on the floor, like I said, and I have these white tarps that I put on the ground. And I do that because often the ground in any studio I've had, whether it's a concrete floor or wood floor, is very distracting. And since the painting is on the floor, if I have this white paper down, it's sort of like how when you mix paint, you mix it on a white palette. So it just keeps everything very neutralized, and I can see what I'm doing very clearly. And like I said, because the work is so much about color, the white of the tarp really helps me just focus and see the color without any kind of other distractions. Of course, many years ago, I found that I was using these tarps to clean my brushes, or paint would spill, footprints would happen, and I started putting down gessoed canvas on top of the tarps to catch any of the kind of natural miscellaneous marks that would occur. And then I would save these, I call them tarps, these canvases, and stretch them later on another stretcher bar. And this has been very exciting because it can be very hard to always be thinking about what painting you want to make, and it's such a forward way of thinking. And so to sort of make a painting by accident, or to have the foundation of the work created in this very backhanded way, is really exciting, because then I'm just responding to something that I made, but with a different level of intention. And I have works that are the tarp kind to show you, but I think this picture just kind of sets that discussion up. And so again, this is my studio, probably early 2013, probably January or February. The color is a little bleached out in these images, but the border in this painting is a very, very pale, blushy pink. And this color was very specific. I really was trying to get a very particular kind of pink. It's very mixed. And my original thought, I'd already made that painting with the grid border, the red grid border, the tall one. And I wanted to make that painting sort of in a different way. I loved that red grid, but I didn't want it to have a white background. And I thought if I had this sort of blushy pink as the background, I would do the red grid on top. And I loved the grid so much that I thought, okay, I'm going to give it even more room in this next painting. So I kind of shrunk the amount of the internal picture plane so I'd have more grid. But after I got that blushy pink down, I was so in love with it that I didn't want to contaminate it or put that red grid down. So I just, didn't do it. And that happens a lot. I'll start a painting, I may finish it, I'll get an idea while I'm doing it, or there's an alteration, and sometimes the next painting will be the road I didn't take. So this is a smaller piece. This is about, it's maybe 58 by 58. And this is another kind of framing that I'm doing. Instead of making a border that feels like a frame, this one is the circle. And then the gray part is very thick paint that's alligatored, which is a term, and I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's when the oil paint wrinkles up. And I did it so there'd be these cutaways through the circle, so that there would be this ambiguity between foreground and background. And the circle and the square is a very classical motif, and I like that historical content about it. It's a very architectural relationship. So this is an example of one of those tarp paintings where all the kind of brushy stuff this was the canvas on the floor in my studio. I was making paintings on top of it. And then this is it's pretty bleached out, so just try to imagine that it looks a lot better. Um, what's that? Yeah, I don't know if that helps. I'm just doing it with my monitor, but you don't have that effect, do you?
No, I can't see it.
Yeah. I'm used to it. I think yeah, I think it's better to have some lights on because then it goes too high contrast. Thank you, though. So this is a tarp painting, and what I'll do is, I'll work on this for a while, and then I'll kind of decide, like, does it feel interesting enough? And then I usually I lift it up from the floor and pin it on the wall and think about, are there interesting areas to it? Can it be used as an entire piece? Does it need to be cut up for parts? And in this case, I thought there was a large enough section that was interesting. So I just measured out the part that I thought was good, and then ordered a stretcher bar. And then it was stretched on the bar. And then the next thing I have to do is decide what I'm going to do to it, because for me to just leave it just as this tarp isn't enough. It just feels my intention isn't present enough, and it's not compelling to me. It doesn't hold my interest, and it's not satisfying. Like, I need to have more connection with it. So in this case, I wanted a lot of the tarp to show because there were so many interesting moments, I thought, happening in it. So then I just sort of drew these shapes and then painted around. So you can see how it's stretched and it goes around the side. And so, this is very pretty, how it goes around the edge. Pretty is probably a bad word to use. It's, I don't know, I really like it. I really like seeing it wrap around the edge. And I don't really think too consciously about the sides of the paintings in other instances, but in this case, it's so clear that it's more important. And the thick white paint is a heavier application of oil paint, and then it's spray painted. And in this case, it was spray painted with two kinds of white. One was a more pure white, and the other was a sort of cream. So this is another piece. This is from 2012. It's very thinly applied paint, and the border or edging on it is Mars Violet, which is one of my favorite colors. Particularly the one made by Blocks. And in this piece, there are a lot of floating shapes. A few years ago, I really emptied out what was happening in the paintings, and in a lot of cases, the work had interconnecting areas. But what the limitation of the interconnections are that as you go through the painting, you have less and less shapes that you can make up because they've got to fit like a puzzle into each other. So at a certain point, I just sort of unhinged everything. And while I was making the very complicated paintings, there would be moments where I hadn't filled in areas. So I would see parts of these paintings developing with very worked areas and then very underworked areas. And I would get used to this, and at a certain point I thought, it looks pretty good right now with these unfinished areas. So then I just started consciously making paintings that from the start were intended to have this sort of field of white. And this is a good example of that. It didn't feel that these shapes should just be left floating in the white field, though. The painting didn't feel resolved until I put that Mars Violet red, it's like Mars Violet red, I think is the color, edge. Then it sort of held everything together. I find that a lot of the differing elements inside the paintings need a kind of structure or organizing principle or something that maybe even not just formally but almost psychologically holds things together. So now I'm sort of switching time periods. This is 2007. This is one of my earlier oval in a rectangle paintings. It's got the border thing happening, but it's one of the early ones. And my paintings were more opaque and darker during this period. And since then, they've lightened up considerably. I think it's been an effect of doing so many watercolors and works on paper, which I'll show you in a little while. So in this case, the circle, but also maybe even more importantly, the symmetry happening within the oval is the organizing principle. And I got really excited about using symmetry as a way to organize the chaos, and did this maybe 5 or 6 times in paintings. So, and this is actually one of my favorite paintings. I really still love this piece. I think I feel very connected to a lot of the color relationships and a lot of the marks that are happening inside of it. And so that is a turquoise, very thick edge that separates what's happening inside the oval with outside of the oval. Every other part of the paint is very thinly applied. It's very terped out, has a very minimal texture. This painting, I think, is also from around 2007, 2008. Again, a symmetrical painting. I'm showing this one, though, because this is sort of the beginning of things really becoming more transparent and really lightening up. You can see that there are some measuring lines drawn down the center axis and then across the center axis. None of it's hand measured. I would just draw those marks and then kind of eyeball everything inside. I don't really enjoy measuring, and even when I measure, I tend to mismeasure, so I find I'm better off just eyeballing it. And I think the paintings look more interesting eyeballed than measured. So the one thick outlining line, or actually I think there are a few, that turquoise line and the aqua line in the center, there's 2 reds, and then someplace else in there too, maybe the 2 purple circles at the top, upper right and left. And this was sort of the symmetrical masterpiece because it's symmetrical left to right, and it's almost symmetrical top and bottom. And this painting, I really had this urge to combine all of these colors together, and I had been holding back. And when I started this piece, I just said, you know what, I'm allowed, it's so dumb, but in your head it doesn't sound dumb, it's just you in your head. But sometimes when you say this stuff out loud, it really doesn't sound like a big idea and it sounds kind of silly. Hopefully you know what I mean. There were so many colors that I would see together and I would really want to put them together, but I would just feel like, oh, you can't do that. That's too horrible, or ugh, you know. And so I was just like, forget it. I'm just going to do this one painting and get all of it out of my system. And I liked it. Somebody saw this painting, and this is a really irritating comment, and they were like, it's like the female, wait, what was it? What did they say? It's like the feminine versus the female. I know. A man said that. So where did I get this symmetry idea? I actually got it from someplace. I had an exhibition in 2005 at the Renaissance Society, which is a very beautiful exhibition space in Chicago. It's a non-collecting museum. They do about 5 or 6 shows a year. The shows are up for about 6 weeks. They do a book with they do a publication with every show. And again, it's one of those spaces where they completely redesign the interior of the space specifically for every exhibition. There hadn't been a painting show at the Renaissance Society for like 5 years or something until I had my show. And so a lot of the space had been black for video work, and they were pretty excited to have white walls and to have this big change. And again, you know, they asked me how I wanted the walls, and the lesson I learned here was to just tell the curator to make the decision, or at least say propose something, which she did, and she made the walls symmetrical. So when you walked into the space, the way the walls were designed on the left were the same as the right. And this was brilliant because in this exhibition I was showing 9 years of work, and it was like from my maybe when I was 25 or 26 until I was 35. So that's a huge, that's a huge span of time in terms of how you change as a person from your 20s to your mid 30s. And so the work wildly changed. The work was wildly different from scale to what I was, how I was painting and what I was painting. So the way to kind of unite this very disparate body of work was really assisted by the architectural plan of the symmetry, because the symmetry just sort of balanced out the install and the paintings in a way that it could just, their wild differences could be organized and kind of calmed down. So that was the view right when you walked in. And there were 24 paintings in the show. So 2005 is the year, and before this time period, right before the Renaissance Society show, I had the opportunity to live in Germany for almost a year. And that experience really made a big shift in my work. Before 2005 and before I lived in Germany, my work had been very field-based. You can see in both of these paintings that there's a sort of feeling that the painting could continue on beyond the picture plane. It didn't end. Both of these paintings are very different kind of spaces, but they both feel expansive and like they're cross-sections of something larger. And I was interested in a very traditional type of abstract space where there's a foreground, a background, and then something that might literally articulate the picture plane itself. And then I was in Germany, and this was my studio there. And a lot of things happened. Moving to a foreign country, traveling, seeing lots of different work. The museums that I was visiting had predominantly European paintings. When you go to an American museum and you're looking at work between the 30s and the 60s, it focuses primarily on the United States. When I was in Europe, I was suddenly looking at that same time period, but none of them were American artists. So I was having this sort of re-education. We get so focused on abstract expressionism because it's as a country, it's our first big art movement that's non-European. So being in Europe, I really kind of caught up on what had been happening there. And I think I also just realized that I really loved Cubism. And I saw so many examples of Cubism trickling through art history there, from like Franz Marc's paintings to seeing Cubist sculpture, and it was really inspiring. And then also the studio I moved into had these huge sheets of cardboard, like, big, I don't know, like 6 by 4 foot sheets of cardboard that had been left by a previous tenant, and I could use it. So I just started cutting it up and collaging. And so this act of seeing different work, traveling, and making collages really moved me away from this field-based work that I had been doing. So this is kind of one last field-based work. It's very bright yellow, cadmium yellow light. And here it has that recession of space, that projection of space, and then a very thick kind of splashy mark that was made in very dense paint that wrinkled. And so that sort of called attention to the picture plane itself. And those brown blobs are that thick paint. And there's some gold spray paint there too. The field paintings became very heightened after I had seen a show by Fred Sandbach. I'm not sure if you know his work. He worked primarily with string. And there was an exhibition at the Dia Museum in New York when the Dia was on West 22nd Street. And it was a very large industrial space, multi-floors. And he may have had the entire space or at least one floor of it. It was this industrial space, huge. You didn't even think anything was in there until you'd see these little pieces of string. And it blew me away because it was the simplest gesture and yet it communicated something so intensely about physical space that I found it profound. This is not the show I saw, but it was the best example I could find to communicate the experience that I had. And you see this red, and it's just articulating this slice of space in the room in a way that you thought something was, that the space was empty and void, but in fact, when you see this, you're like, oh my God, this entire space is just densely sliced little layers of air. And when you start thinking it goes this way, you then think, oh, it goes this way. And it's just, I found it completely, it just kind of blew my mind. And so that really heightened this idea of space and how we see it, and it heightened my interest in what I was already doing with the field paintings. So these are some of the collages that I made when I first got to Germany. Small. I don't know how, this is maybe smaller than 18, it's smaller than 18 by 24. And this is 2004. So it's watercolor paper, ink, acrylic paint, and cardboard. And then they were put in a group show in Berlin, and this is when I started working with my gallery in Berlin, Gallery Barbara Weiss. So this is 2005 now. And then this is another one. I have a feeling this is a little bleached out. They're framed on MDF platforms. So it's a larger sheet of MDF proportional to the work on paper, and the MDF is painted white, so it's like a little platform that sort of just pushes the collage out from the wall, but it's not behind glass because they're very tactical and physical, and putting it behind glass would just sort of neutralize, I think, the texture. So it had a direct effect on the paintings. This is a painting I was making in Germany in 2005. I had the Renaissance Society agreed to ship 3 paintings from Germany to Chicago for my show, which was imminently happening. I mean, I think you can kind of see the space is different now. It's fractals, it's shards, it's about things next to each other. I think I at least see how the collages have divided everything out in a different way. Instead of trying to divide things this way, it's dividing it this way. And then that's the finished piece. So this is 2005. This is this year. And I still see that these are very connected. This is organized in a different way. And it's sort of busy and empty at the same time. I'm using a particular shape at the moment. It's a scallop. And like I've said, I've used zigzags. I'm interested in the scallop shape right now because it seems like such a dangerous shape to use. A zigzag seems tougher and less gender specific. A scallop seems very feminine and decorative. And so I'm sort of interested in it. And that's a detail. So again, these paintings are very, there's a very light touch. It's with brush, very turped out paint, very stained. This is an installation shot from this year, this fall in Chicago at Corbett versus Dempsey. They have a crazy exhibition space, wood floor, toned brick walls. It's very difficult, but I love that about it. And so I had 3 paintings from this year, 2013, and then we had a whole run of watercolors, I call them drawings, from right after I came out of graduate school until this year. I went to graduate school in Chicago, so going back to Chicago and having a show there and having a representation of my work from right when I got out of school until now with the drawings was a really kind of fun experience for me. Fun isn't the right word. Meaningful. It's too colloquial. This is an example of the watercolors. So it's fairly chronological from left to right. And it started here. So that purple one here is probably 95 or 94. I think it's 94 because I think I made that at Skowhegan, and then it wraps around. These I think are from 2012 from the show, just sort of a little view of them together. My initials. I started putting my initials in my work back in graduate school in the early 90s. Robert Ryman, his early work had all these, he would sign his name, but he would use his name as a formal element in the paintings. And I always thought that was such a brilliant way to be kind of an egomaniac, but have it make sense and be part of the piece. So I think I got the idea from him. And I've done it for years and years. I have lots of Rebecca paintings, and now I just keep it in the drawings. So this is just kind of 3 grouped together so you can see some repeating motifs. When I do the watercolors, I tend to just set up my studio for about 2 weeks just to do works on paper, and then that's all I do. I come in 6 hours a day, I just make the watercolors, and then after about 2 weeks, I stop. I put them all in a box, and I don't look at them usually again for a long time, and I don't edit anything. I find that it's better to wait to see what I really think after some time and distance has gone by. But as a result, I find that there are all kinds of things that I do ahead of time in the works on paper that come to the paintings later. And I usually only see this in hindsight because I'm not going through these boxes all the time. But these sort of dashy lines have been happening in the drawings for many years, but has only recently started happening in the paintings. This is a suite of very early drawings. My paintings at the time looked like this, these sort of ovular, blobby shapes that were layered on top of each other. So these are probably 90s, 97. These are these date pieces that I've done. Also with the signature, you put your name and then you put the date. I'm also a big fan of Ankawara's work. I really like the way he marks time and that there's so much about a kind of a sense of mortality. I mean, obviously mine are not carrying that kind of weight at all, but I really respect his work a great deal. I like the structure and the rigidity of the practice as well. So these 2 drawings are from 1995. One is from my sketchbook, and they were just different titles of things I was thinking of for shows or exhibition titles. A lot of it was from music. And this was a piece that I made after school. Photography has always been very important to me. When I was an undergrad for a while, I think I was thinking maybe I'd be a photographer and not a painter. I don't actually ever remember making a decision. I just suddenly was a painter, which I guess I just made the decision very smoothly. But I've always continued to take pictures, lots of visual notes, lots of I know everybody does this now because you have a camera on your phone and there's blogs and Tumblrs. But there was a time when this was actually, people weren't doing this as much. So I actually carried 35 millimeter film around. And then, I know it sounds so crazy to talk about, but if I didn't want film in there and I wanted slide, I'd have to think about it. So it'd be like one day I'd go out, I'd only had one camera. So one day I'd go out and just take slide film. And then the next day I'd go out and take all the same pictures, but with 35 millimeter film, because this is the way you had to do it. So, and I also had a car at this point. It's like after 1995, I inherited my grandmother's car in Chicago, which was great because it meant that I could rent a studio and it was cheap and I didn't have to paint at my house and I could get there. And it meant I could drive all over the city and take pictures of the urban environment. And I had grown up in Connecticut, And there are parts of Connecticut that are urban, but I hadn't lived in a city like Chicago before, so it was really stimulating and inspiring. And one thing I was taking pictures of a lot was the Little Caesars pizza guy, Little Caesar. And what's interesting about him is how often, if you take enough pictures of him, and I think you can still see this today, there's so many little minute formal differences. Like in some of them you can see his elbow is curved, and in others it's like an angle. And you just think, why is that happening? Like, why is one franchise got a curved elbow and the other has a bent one? I don't know, like, did they redesign him at some point? And then I start thinking, like, why? Like, what kind of change does just a curve in the elbow mean enough that you actually go to the trouble of changing it and replacing the sign that had the other elbow? And then you can see, too, that there's pieces of pizza, and they have polka dots for pepperoni. So right away, I like the idea that pepperoni and polka dots are now the same thing. And then some of them have 2 pepperonis, and then others have many more pepperonis. And so I wonder, like, maybe they were skimping on pepperoni, so if they had the cartoon with too much, it caused a problem. I don't know, like, but this is the stuff I would notice and think about. And I think, I mean, you're laughing, but what we're discussing is formalism. And when it's 1995 and I'm 25 years old, I'm discovering what I'm interested in through film. And I'm seeing that I am really interested in formal shifts and little permutations and what they might mean. And I think this is very key to everything I'm still doing in my work, whether it's color or mark making or the width of a line or where a line is or how big a shape is, whether it touches, whether it's by itself. All of this is incredibly crucial and important. So I also would take these stickers, and I think that Little Caesars sticker gave me every idea for this painting. So the orange background, the really blobby, bad beiges, and there he is. And that's a painting from 1995. So this is an example of the pictures I was taking in Chicago. And you can see, right, it's pretty clear. And this is another thing that I still take pictures of, which are these high school rocks. And again, it goes back to this idea of time and marking time. You know, a graduating high school class will paint the rock, and they'll put their year on it, their graduating year, and it's like, oh, 9, you know. And then the next year, or actually this is 2000. And then the next class will paint it up and put their year on it. And I find this sort of fascinating, and then this idea of painting over. So this is a very early painting from 1996, and this is after the Little Caesars painting, 1 year, and the sticker is now gone. I don't need the stickers anymore. I don't need the stickers to give me ideas, and I want to make paintings that are purely about paint. The dialogue about painting at this time in the 90s is very contentious. I was spared from most of it living in Chicago, but if I had lived in any other major metropolitan area, I probably would have not been able to paint or been given much more trouble than I was. But I wanted to make paintings that were just truly made in the most traditional way, and that was a big decision. And there's a lot of work I'm not showing you at this early point where I heavily experiment with collage, and I go through a whole body of work, at least 2 bodies of work, where I'm making paintings in the language of painting, but none of them involve paint. So this going back and affirming making a painting was a big deal, and it's this is 1996. This painting is 2007, and I show it right after because I still see a connection in my interests. Dividing out of things, internal shapes, and even some color interests that are still the same. Here, there's a greater freedom. The shapes are free-floating. The brown is just brown paint filled in after those shapes were rendered. This is another one from that time period. So these kind of isolated shapes, but the field or ground between them, in this case, is spray painted gold and silver. I also went through a period of making small shaped paintings. I still could make these, but I've just been a little less interested in it. That's in my studio. This is in a solo show I had in 2009 in Germany. They flanked the second room of the show, and then that was how it looked dead on. So there were 2 equilateral triangles framing the doorway, and then inside the doorway were 2 isosceles triangles. This is one of them installed at a friend's house. They look pretty triumphant. I like it with the fireplace. I love seeing artwork in a domestic setting. I think it's incredibly flattering that someone would want to live with a work of art in their home. To look at it every day and decide that they want to spend time with it like that they've committed to a daily existence with a work of art. And I think that is probably the nicest thing that could happen. I mean, it's very exciting to be in a public collection, but to actually live with something and to want to look at it every day and to have a relationship with it, I mean, that's so much of what I think about when I'm making work. And that's what I base my interest in my own work. When I'm making something I feel that I could live with or that I feel really connected with, those are some of the ideas. So the shaped, this idea of the shaped canvas started, on the small scale was interesting, so I started kind of toying with it in making a large shaped painting. And I can't remember where this comes in, like after I did the big triangle that I'm about to show you or before, but this is the shape of a triangle incised, in a regular rectilinear form. That was the professional shot. This is the one with my camera in my studio. I kind of like this one better. So I thought I should really make a big triangle. Like really take this small idea I had of the little triangle or the diamond, I even did some circles, and make a shaped painting that was really large. This is 100 inches tall. It was really hard. This is the first go at it, which I destroyed. This is the second go. Now it's moving along. There's another painting next to it, and see, that's what they look like as I'm making them. So you can see at a certain point I got used to seeing them that way and wanted to make a painting that looked empty like that. So that's just kind of an idea of what I was seeing. Now, the problem with taking so many pictures in your studio is that sometimes you see things at an earlier stage and you realize you should have stopped. So there's a fleshy kind of peachy thing there. If I made this today, I would have left it like it was and I wouldn't have done anything more to it. At the time, it felt too empty. So you can see what I did to it. So at this point, my aesthetic was to really fill things up and to make it cacophonous. Now my aesthetic would be probably to pull back more. But there it is finished, and it's against a tarp that I had on the floor that I was putting on the wall. And I know it's really hard to look at, but I love them together. So here's the triangle painting at an art fair, maybe Frieze, London. This is it at a museum in Switzerland. This painting is still unsold, so I can just keep following its travels. Yeah, it's a little dumb, but I enjoy it. So I decided that I really liked that triangle painting, but I didn't want to make any big shaped paintings. It was kind of hokey, a little gimmicky. You can make one, but I realized I wasn't really interested in the shaped canvas on a large scale. I was interested in irregular polygons and shapes, but within the confining structure of a rectilinear form. So this is an example of me kind of realizing, no, this is what I want to do. So this is a strange shape that's sort of fighting and pushing against the borders. And hopefully you can see it's white on white here, but maybe you can see the edge of the painting. Here I am making it. So you can get it. This is my old studio. You can kind of see what it looked like. This is a detail. It's 76 by 70, and it was made in 2008. This is a picture of the Made in Space show. It first happened in LA at a gallery called Night Gallery, and then a couple months later it traveled to Gavin Brown and Venus Over Manhattan. And I had this piece in the LA version, and this is just, I think I'm showing this because it relates to the large shaped triangle painting, but I think I'm doing everything the way I want to do it more than in that triangle. So it's a diamond, but I'm using the space around the diamond to do other things, to have more of a relationship with the internal areas. This is my manifesto poster. This is my favorite picture of the manifesto poster. A friend of mine was visiting a friend of his in New York, and this was the communal studio kitchen, and he took a picture of it. He was like, oh, your manifesto is at this artist studio in New York. And I was so flattered. And I love that it's like near the coffee machine, and like there's a sink there too, I think. It's very dim picture, but I just thought, yeah, everything's right there. The manifesto and the coffee machine, the Windex. This is the last image I'm showing you today, and it's a very recent painting. I just finished it last month. It's white, it's just the gesso. And then there's a border that's thickly applied lines that are spray painted silver. So, and then I have a detail of it. So, that's the last picture. So, maybe if you have some questions for me?
You mentioned that you were kind of white on white, and I was wondering why you do that.
Why I do what?
Spray paint, you spray two different colors of white.
Oh, yeah. In that painting, I did it because the spray paint is a very when spray paint is flat or a single color and it's non-metallic, it's a very undynamic surface. So by having two colors that are close and sort of spraying them, it just creates a more interesting surface, and it animates the picture plane more. It was just going to be too flat and dead to just have one white, but I didn't want it to be high contrast and have two different colors because the background was already so colorful. So just having white and then just two versions of it. In fact, I would have even liked the whites to be even closer to each other, but in spray paint, it's like white, Navajo white, and gray. So you have these sort of color shifts, but that's why I did it in that painting.
What has been your most challenging path as an artist? Like, what is the most challenging path as an artist? Like, what is the hardest path? Like, for you?
I have to really think. I think that's a good sign, right? Well, there are a lot of different hard things, and there are some things that are hard at some time, and the same thing's happening, but it bothers you more or less. At different times, when I moved to LA 15 or 16 years ago, it was really hard. That move was pretty hard because I hadn't gone to school in Southern California, and the school system was so tight, and people were only really interested in all the people who had just graduated from school, and they had all their connections. So I felt very outside, and there was no real natural way to break in, and that was hard. Sometimes it's been hard to maintain a kind of balance in my life from wanting to be in my studio and work really hard, but also be engaged outside in another part of my life. Those things, you're always renegotiating them. Like you've got a great system for 2 weeks and then suddenly it doesn't work anymore. Yeah, so I think like feeling invisible sometimes in LA, which I don't feel that much anymore, but I did for a period of time. I think just realizing that my momentum for everything that I needed to do as an artist could really only come from myself. It takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of belief in yourself to maintain all the time, and it's exhausting. Yeah.
I didn't see it was related, but the first set of shots of the Kutala and the exhibition layout, and even some of the zigzags, made me think of Elisitsky and those cats, and then the last, the one of the kitchen and coffee and the black, dark manifesto. Made me think of Malevich.
Sure. I think those are all people who lived with manifestos, so that's good. Yeah, I like that. I like that work a lot. Yeah.
How do you choose your scale?
I have preferences. You know, I like squares. I tend to like off squares proportionally. They like a 65 by 67 is something that looks really good because at first it feels very neutral, but then it's like a little bit jazzy because there's something off about it, but it's barely imperceptible. So the image isn't as static, but it's still neutral, things like that. I don't really usually like very extreme shapes, like super skinny things. I tend to like fatter rectangles.
Is there a body relationship with the size of the body to the center?
No. No. I feel like I should be saying yes to that, but no. Right now, I'm trying to make paintings that are way bigger than myself because even if a painting's large, even that one painting I showed at the beginning with the red grid, that's 106 by 80 and a half. And I know that size so well because that was the largest painting I could get in my previous studio. So that measurement was like hardwired in my head. I knew that space. Like it's big, but it didn't feel big anymore because I knew how to use it. So I'm really interested right now in a shape that's in canvas that's so large that I'm completely unable to control it or find my bearing to it. Like for instance, some of the ones in my studio now are so heavy I can't lift them by myself. So they're like way out of body scale. And I'm finding that really challenging and interesting. I can't paint when they're on the floor in the middle. I have a bridge that has to be wheeled across, you know. Like these things make it all more difficult, but I think I'm really interested in that level of challenge. But I also have made a commitment, not so much recently, but in the past, to try actively to make paintings on all scales, because that dislocation from one scale to another kind of keeps it fresh. It's like being an athlete and being like a runner, a swimmer, you know what I mean? Like you're really fit if you can do all of those things.
You mentioned earlier you went to Germany, and most of the artists that you saw there were all European artistry. How did you break into that market to have all your work shown in Europe?
When I was living in Germany, I was introduced, I had an American friend who was living in Berlin, and we met for coffee. And we met for coffee right across the street from this gallery. And he said, oh, let's go and see Barbara Weiss's show. So we went over there and I met Barbara. And I don't know, it's just one of those weird things. It was just luck. And Barbara, I was about to have my show at the Wren. And so, you know, Barbara knew what the Wren was, so she was a little more interested in me than if I was just some painter. And so we started talking, and she showed, and still does, an artist who I really liked, Raoul de Keyser. And I didn't know that she was his German art dealer. And so I had this like really, I was like, oh my God, like freak out moment. And I think she was just kind of amused by it because not many people at that point, like Americans, really knew about his work so much. So it was sort of a novelty. And she's a very sweet woman, so she's like, oh, do you want to see some of his paintings? So basically what happened was we just had a very natural connection, and it wasn't artificial, and it just sort of developed, and she just casually said, send me some images. And I did. Yeah, it was really, I have to say, it was probably the most important thing that's happened in my career that was so seamless and beautiful. And it really is just about that we connected and we still do. We just have a natural kind of relationship. And it's special, you know, and I'm very fortunate, and I think it's probably highly unusual.
So are you one of the few that are doing that now, or is it more of the mainstream?
What, doing what exactly?
Showing in Europe, Americans showing up?
Oh, I think a lot of Americans show in Europe. I mean, I don't know. She shows a bunch of American artists or non-European artists, and I mean, it's definitely a very special thing to be able to do, and I'm fully aware of that. Yeah. I think, yeah, Red again.
What made you choose LA instead of?
When I was at Skowhegan, right after graduate school, there were so many people from art school in LA. And I grew up in Connecticut. I had moved to the Midwest to go to graduate school. So the idea of like continuing to move seemed interesting. And all these people had just come out of art school in LA, and Cal Arts, Art Center, Otis, UCLA, and it really seemed through them that LA was so fascinating and exciting. And so after Skowhegan that fall, I went to visit my friends, and I just really liked it. And I didn't want to move, I knew I didn't want to stay in Chicago forever, but I didn't want to move to New York because being from Connecticut, and my grandparents lived in the city, and I knew how hard it would be as an artist to make it in New York, or not even to make it, but to just literally be an artist there was too hard. To have a studio, I knew I'd have to work. I worried I'd never get to my studio. I just didn't see it as really feasible. I didn't have a trust fund. I was paying for graduate school myself. I had student loans. So LA had the east side of LA had a very similar sort of price structure as Chicago. And I moved with a whole bunch of friends. We just caravanned across the country. I was 29. I, wasn't married. I had no kids. I only had, I had a cat. There was not, why not? So it was highly unstrategic, except that I didn't want to live in New York.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.